Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Susie Gelman, and I'm privileged to serve as the board chair of Israel Policy Forum. I want to welcome those of you who are joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time today, and welcome back our returning viewers. Before we begin, I want to thank our supporters. Our work, including today's program, is made possible by you. If you don't yet support our work, please consider doing so by visiting www.israelpolicyforum.org/support. I would also like to take this moment to announce a new 5-part virtual learning series hosted by the Union for Reform Judaism and Israel Policy Forum entitled The State of Two States, Exploring Today's Issues, Challenges, and Opportunities. This program will feature top experts on the state of US-Israel relations, Israeli-Palestinian relations, Arab-Israeli normalization, settlements in the West Bank, and Israeli and Palestinian civil society. The series begins on Wednesday, November 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern, with a session featuring our policy director, Michael Koplow, and Lahav Harkov of the Jerusalem Post, in conversation with our CEO, David Halperin. You can find the registration link for the series in the chat below, so feel free to sign up. Now on to today's briefing. For the first time in more than 3 years, Israel has a state budget. Late last week, the Knesset passed budgets for 2021 and 2022, averting elections and stabilizing Israel's governing coalition. This development represents a significant victory for Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and his government, and a substantial defeat for Opposition Leader Benjamin Netanyahu's hopes of an imminent return to power. However, Bennett and his partners still face the challenge of managing an ideologically diverse coalition with conflicting visions on fundamental issues, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're delighted to be joined today by Amir Tibon of Haaretz to explore what might come next in Israeli politics now that the coalition has overcome its first significant challenge. As always, we welcome your questions, so please type them in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. A recording of this broadcast will be published later on our website at www.israelpolicyforum.org/briefings. With that, Amir, thanks so much for joining us once again.
Hi, Susie. It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank you and Israel Policy Forum for inviting me, and everyone who joined today for the conversation. It is indeed a very weird choice for a subject in a way to talk about passing a state budget. In the past, I don't think we would have done a webinar about it, but some weird things have been happening in Israeli politics in recent years, and suddenly the passage of a state budget becomes a major political event, just like you explained right now, something that has implications beyond the monetary realm and actually really affecting the political arena.
Thank you for that helpful intro and observation. And you're right, it would not normally be the topic of a webinar because it would be something that would be standard, but
another Tuesday.
Another Tuesday, but we'll dive into some of this, obviously. So, Amir, for starters, could you please walk us through the specifics of what recently transpired in the Knesset? What is included in the pieces of legislation that were passed? Political observers largely expected the coalition to succeed in passing the budget, but were there any surprises as to how it happened?
So first of all, I do want to take a minute, Susie, to explain why it is even significant that we're discussing. You said the first time in 3 years, but I want to give, first of all, maybe a bit of a personal example. So while I do have the Knesset here in the background, it's a picture. I'm joining you today from my home in Kibbutz Nachal Oz, which is the closest place in Israel to Gaza, small community right on the Gaza border. I moved back here after spending 3 years in the United States, in Washington, D.C. I moved back late last year. And when I returned to the kibbutz, I remembered being surprised that all kinds of infrastructure projects in our community and in the region that I remember that they started when we left for Washington, D.C., when I took on the role of the Washington correspondent for Haaretz, they were not finished yet. It's, you know, I spent 3 years in Washington. I come back to my home community and I see the road that was supposed to be constructed is left in the same place where it was. And all kinds of other projects are completely stuck. And I was asking people in our community and in the area, what happened? Why is everything stuck? And I got one answer all the time: because there is no state budget. Because the previous governments, and I say governments because all of this happened during a period of time where Netanyahu had one government and it fell apart, and we went to an election and he couldn't form a new one. And then later on, after two other elections, he did form a unity government with Benny Gantz, but it didn't achieve much. All of these Netanyahu-led governments did not pass a new state budget, and that created real problems on the ground. It's not just a theoretical political issue, something that happens in the Knesset. It had real life implications on Israeli communities all over the country. I gave you my own personal story, but there were stories like this happening everywhere, because once you don't have a state budget approved, then there is no state funding for a lot of projects and a lot of programs and a lot of long-term planning. And we are going to pay the price for this lack of a state budget for 3 years, years ahead from now. So it is important that we did finally see one passed last week, but it's also important to remember how we got here. And after those 3 long years of political instability and 4 election cycles, and as I said, no state budget, we finally, in June, had a new government formed, the government led by Naftali Bennett and his partner in crime in the eyes of Benjamin Netanyahu, the crime of removing him from office, Yair Lapid. And one of the first commitments that this new government, and as you mentioned, Susie, it's a very eclectic government. It's a coalition government of 8 different parties, from Meretz and an Islamist party, all the way to Naftali Bennett's Yamina, which means in Hebrew further to the right, ideologically diverse as can be. But one of the first tasks that this government took upon itself was to stabilize the country, because having 4 elections in just over 2 years is complete madness. Not having a state budget for 3 years is even beyond complete madness. Like I said, it actually began to impact people's lives, and people were seeing stuff getting stuck around them everywhere. And long-term projects in trains and roads and housing couldn't get further. And so the government took upon itself the mission of stabilizing and creating a normal country once again, as much as Israel can be normal. We all know that's a different discussion. I think the first few months, the stabilization was mostly around COVID, first of all, because we were emerging from these 2 difficult years of lockdowns and restrictions. And this government said, we're going to deal with the 4th COVID wave, the Delta wave here in Israel, without another lockdown. And they did it by taking a big gamble on vaccines and doing the booster shots, which worked beautifully. And today, Israel is completely open and COVID is at a very low level. And then they moved on to this big task of passing the budget. And this is stabilization, not just in the economic sense that we need a budget in order for things to function and for the trains to run on time, and hopefully so we can have new, better trains and better service. But it's also stabilization in the political arena, because once a state budget is passed, it becomes much more difficult for a government in Israel to fall from power. This is a bit of a complex issue, but the way that the law in Israel works today, it was changed in recent years, is that in order for a vote of no confidence in the Knesset to bring down a government, it's not enough for that vote to win a majority in the Knesset itself. You also need to be able to present an alternative government. And right now, and we can get more into it later, maybe, Susie, that looks very unlikely that there will be a majority for an alternative government in this Knesset. But if this government had failed to pass a state budget, it would automatically dissolve and we would go to new elections. That is just the law here in Israel. If you don't pass a state budget over time, you will have an election triggered automatically. The previous governments, the Netanyahu governments, delayed this time and again by passing very problematic legislation that basically said, we're giving ourselves extra time with passing the budget. And they never completed the mission, but it allowed this endless cycle of elections to keep going. And now this new government, after less than half a year in office, passed the budget and created a situation in which it will be very difficult for its opponents to bring it down. And we can now talk about, hopefully, long-term political stability, which in Israel means probably 2 years without an election.
And obviously, we're going to want to get into this some more. But can you talk a little bit about what actually was in the legislation, if there were specifics?
Yes.
Specifics in the budget that was passed? I mean, not to go through the whole thing, but just sort of like, what are the standouts? And again, Amir, were there any surprises that they actually were able to pass a budget given the last 3 years' experience?
So there were no surprises in the voting mechanism itself. The coalition right now, although it's composed of 8 parties, it has a really bare bones majority of basically 61 seats versus 59 for the opposition. And all the 61 voted in favor of the entire budget. There was one moment where a member of Knesset from Labor, I think it was Emily Muati, a new member of Knesset, accidentally voted in one of the clauses. Basically, you don't vote for the entire budget in one vote and go home. The budget is made, I think this one was made of something like 780 different clauses, and you vote on each and every one of them. And at one point in one of the votes, Emily Muati, a member of Knesset from Labor, she was tired and confused, and she voted with the opposition. And that clause, I think it had to do with a budget for larger classrooms in Israeli schools, fell down because the opposition voted against it. And then they had to reintroduce it and vote on it again, and it created a bit of a delay. That was the only important, important is a big word, but that was the most significant surprise. I do want to say, to Emily Muati's credit, she's not the only one. There was a member of Knesset who actually got confused 6 different times, and 6 times voted not the way that he should have. That member of Knesset is Benjamin Netanyahu, the leader of the opposition and the former prime minister. He also got tired as these votes on the 780 clauses were ongoing, and 6 different times he voted with the coalition instead of voting with his allies from the opposition. Which was a funny moment. And of course, people in the government said, you get mixed up in 6 different votes and you want to lead the country. But that's just trolling, because honestly, I think any one of us here, would have probably gotten confused at least several times in such a long, and this whole thing lasted for 2 days. In terms of the contents of it, so a lot of it is really the standard, just enlarging what you would expect a new government promising in its first passed budget, enlarging the education investment. A lot of it will go into long-term projects in infrastructure and transportation, trains and roads and buses. You got one, I think, more politically explosive part of it. Is the reform in the kashrut certification in Israel, which is a fascinating issue. And honestly, Susie, we could do a whole webinar just about that. We talk about it a bit today in the Haaretz podcast that I recorded, came up a few hours ago, but it's a huge thing. We have a religious affairs minister, Matan Kahana, from Naftali Bennett's party, from the Yamina party, who is initiating a reform that will significantly weaken the ultra-Orthodox chief rabbinate of Israel and create more of a private market for kashrut certifications in Israel, in the hope that it would lower the prices that businesses in Israel have to pay in order to be recognized as kosher. And that will then lead to lower consumer prices, whether it's for food you buy in the supermarket that is labeled as kosher, or for kosher restaurants, or, and I think this could be significant for many of our listeners, hotels in Israel. Because most of the hotels in Israel, at least the large ones, are recognized as kosher, and they have to, until now, had to pay a lot of money in the process to the rabbinate. And the hope is that this reform, that the ultra-Orthodox parties who are now in the opposition, Shas and the United Torah Judaism, they are going crazy over it. I mean, they are just in a tantrum. That this reform will lead to also maybe a bit lower and more sane tourism prices in Israel. So these are just some of the examples. I think this one specifically, the kashrut reform, was the most politically kind of a really explosive thing that was included. And I think there was some fear that maybe the Islamist party that is a member of the coalition, the United Arab List, or Ra'am as we call it in Hebrew, might vote against it because they have a partnership with the ultra-Orthodox parties on some religious issues, but they went along with the coalition. And the reason they did it, because this budget also includes a historically significant investment in the Arab sector in Israel. And for Mansour Abbas, the leader of the United Arab List, this is a major achievement. This is why he went into the coalition. This is why he crossed the Rubicon and decided to be a member of a ruling coalition in Israel, not some kind of arrangement like we've seen in the past of an Arab party supporting the government, but not being part of it, or offering support in one vote at a time, but actually being a member of the coalition. And the reason he did it is because he was promised a very significant investment in priorities of the Arab sector, whether it's policing, education, building new cities and neighborhoods, roads, and he got it in this budget. And so his party eventually went along with all of the other clauses as well.
I would just note, we also got infrastructure passed here after more than
indeed.
3 years.
And on the same day, Susie, because by the time the Knesset approved the budget, it was Friday here in Israel. And on that same Friday, the historic infrastructure package of Biden was approved finally in the House.
There you go. Amir, if the Bennett-Lapid government failed to pass this budget, as you noted, it would have automatically sent Israel back to elections and ended this government. So over the past few months, we saw the goal of passing the budget being used by both Bennett and Lapid as a means of encouraging compromise and keeping this unwieldy coalition unified. Now that this existential test is in the rearview mirror, how, if at all, will it change the dynamics of the coalition itself?
So, of course, I cannot predict the future, but I think there are two kind of analysis you're seeing emerging in the Israeli political discourse right now about what the budget passage would mean for the government. One school of thought says, up until now, everybody behaved. This is basically what you were hinting, Susie. Everybody behaved because the coalition, the government had to stick together and pass the budget, because not passing the budget would have triggered a new election. And the current public opinion polls in Israel show that none of the parties that make up this coalition would benefit from a new election. A new election would, in the best hopes of the members of this ruling coalition, lead to a similar result as the last one, and could actually be worse for some of them. And the one party that we see getting stronger is actually Likud from the opposition. So all of these parties that are in the coalition did not want an election, and everybody behaved in order to have the budget passed. And now that this is behind us, they can begin to be a little more rude and show more chutzpah and insist more on their priorities. And then you will have a lot of confrontations within the coalition, and the government ministers attacking each other on a regular basis, and Meretz trying to take it in one direction, and the Bennett's Yamina in another, and clashes over the Palestinian issues, settlements, religion and state issues, and we can find other priorities where these parties disagree. The other school of thought says, after they passed this important test and proved all of the skeptics wrong, because there were a lot of political analysts, perhaps the most famous of them, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, who said this government will be short-lived, they will not pass a budget, they will collapse, and Likud will come back to power. And these people were proven wrong. So perhaps after passing this test and learning to live with one another and work together, the coalition will only get better at doing this from now on, because the biggest threat is behind. And now they can just work like a normal government and promote all kinds of priorities that are in consensus. One of them, by the way, interestingly enough, we heard yesterday Avigdor Lieberman, the finance minister, who orchestrated this entire budget vote, saying that the government should now move forward on approving the Western Wall agreement, the Kotel deal from several years ago, that was supposed to create an egalitarian a prayer space in the Western Wall, and was approved by Netanyahu at the time, and then he backtracked, and it's been buried ever since. So now Lieberman wants to run along with it, and also an important reform on the issue of Jewish conversions, which Jewish conversions will be recognized in Israel and how. So Lieberman, who has adopted the new political identity of the leader of the secular tribe in Israel and the anti-Haredi warrior, wants to move along on these priorities, and other ministers have their own plans. So maybe the government now, with the budget behind, can actually just work well, function, and move along its priorities. I can't say which of the two is more likely to actually happen, and I suspect that if we're looking at 2 years now of this government working together, which is a completely realistic option at the moment, maybe it will be, more like this at one time and more the other way at other times. You could have several weeks of clashes and explosions and maybe even threats that one of the parties will try to join the opposition somehow. And then you can have calmer days where it seems like everything is working in a more harmonious way. So both of these options, I think, could definitely be seen. I think the one big issue that can still, at the end of the day, cause a real crisis, of course, is the Palestinian issue, because this is where the government really, there is a very, very large disagreement that is difficult to be bridged. And if there will be some security events, maybe in my own backyard here in Gaza, right behind me, or in the north, or or in the West Bank, you could have all of this again, be very, very fragile. I want to say one more thing about this, Susie. There seems to be a big difference in this coalition between how the government ministers from the different parties work together versus the members of Knesset from the different parties. And this is an important distinction. One of the things this government did, it passed a law that in Israel we call the Norwegian law, HaChok HaNorvegi. Basically, it's adopting a model that exists in Norway, whereas if you are a member of the parliament and you become a government minister, you are no longer in the parliament. You give up your seat in parliament and someone else from your party replaces you, and you are now only in the government. So there is this distinction between the executive and the legislative. And this law was passed by this government, and to me it seems, as an observer, that the government ministers from the different parties, Meretz and Yamina, Labor and Gideon Saar's New Hope, which is also right-wing, they actually work together pretty well, and they understand each other quite well, and they are all very committed to this project, because for all of them, this is really the only way to be a government minister. I mean, Labor and Meretz have not been part of a government for many, many years before this eclectic thing was put together. I think the members of Knesset from some of these parties, many of them are, by the way, younger politicians, and it's their first time being in elected office, they feel more committed perhaps to the ideological standings of their own parties, and they are sometimes less in sync with this idea of everybody having to compromise so the government can function. And I think one of the challenges over time will be for the coalition to overcome this gap, to bring the members of Knesset from the different parties to a place where they can also find more consensus and more agreement, like the ministers sitting around the cabinet discussions.
Before the budget passed, the threat of it not happening factored into US-Israel relations, as the Biden administration wanted to avoid actions that could destabilize the government and facilitate Benjamin Netanyahu's return to power. Most notably, reports had suggested that the US would wait until after the budget's passage to reopen the consulate general in Jerusalem. And we spent a whole webinar last week on that topic. How will relations between the Bennett government and the Biden administration change now that the budget has passed?
That's a great question. And I think it makes sense that the Biden, up until now, wanted to take a more cautious approach and let this government survive the first big test, because like you said, Susie, nobody in Washington wants to see Benjamin Netanyahu return to power. And also, I think nobody wanted Israel to go to another cycle of elections, because the Netanyahu threat is one, but also another election could have led to a later election as well, and the whole cycle could have been reopened. Now that this threat is behind us, it could make sense for the American administration to say, okay, some of the priorities that we waited with, we want to move forward on. And the consulate, we heard Yair Lapid just this weekend, after the budget was passed, there was a press conference of Bennett, Lapid, and Lieberman. And Lapid, as the foreign minister, But also I think as the person who's considered the leader of the more center-left moderate bloc in this government, stood up and said, we don't mind if there will be an American consulate in Ramallah, but we don't think there should be a consulate for the Palestinian population in Jerusalem. So now if the administration is moving forward, it's really a direct confrontation out in the open. It's no longer these reports, like you mentioned, Susie, of maybe we'll wait, maybe we'll do it. This is now, the Israeli position has been clearly put on the table, and we'll have to see what the administration chooses to do. I do think that even though the budget is behind us, Biden's approach will still be one of trying to avoid confrontation with Israel on the Palestinian issue or on the consulate, because I think there is a bigger priority for the Biden administration right now, which is, of course, Iran. And sadly, this was the same calculation that the Obama administration had at the time in 2015, that basically, if you had to have a big fight with Israel, it should be over Iran and not over the Palestinian issue. And we saw at the time that the Obama disengaged from the two-state solution negotiations and the Palestinian issue and gave much more of a priority to Iran. I can understand that from the American point of view, that Iran is a much bigger global point of concern and a more pressing and urgent issue. As an Israeli, it saddens me, because I think we need the help of the United States to resolve the conflict with the Palestinians, to make progress on that front. It would have been good to have strong American involvement on this and a commitment to seeing some changes. I don't think Biden is there, honestly. I think the expectations right now are so low. And the fact that there is a new government in Israel not led by Netanyahu, first of all, it doesn't mean that this government can actually take very difficult steps on the Palestinian arena. And it also doesn't solve the complete political mess, the conundrum on the Palestinian side, because we have on the Palestinian side Mahmoud Abbas still in power, still without really a clear public mandate. There has not been any election in 15 years now. The Palestinians are divided between the PA in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. It's really impossible to make significant movement like that. So maybe there will be some kind of confrontation on the consulate, but I don't think we're going to see more broadly significant pressure on the Israeli-Palestinian track. The more difficult issue for the two governments to manage, I suspect, will be the Iranian issue.
I just want to ask a follow-up about the stability of the coalition government, at least at this moment in time. Not asking you to predict the future, but it strikes me that, at least so far, the relationship between Bennett and Lapid is very different, certainly from the relationship that Netanyahu had with Benny Gantz, who I don't think Netanyahu ever had any intention of letting the rotation go to Gantz, but even though ideologically Lapid and Bennett are very, very different on several issues, they seem to be sort of singing from the same hymnal, more or less. And Lapid's messaging seems so far, even on this issue of the consulate general, to be very much echoing what Bennett is saying. So how much would you ascribe the current stability, relative stability of the coalition government to the relationship that the two of them have in their partnership?
So this is a great question. Again, I want to first of all say that when Netanyahu and Gantz formed their short-lived rotation government back in 2020, I remember Yair Lapid going to give an interview, then as the leader of the opposition, and I think it was Channel 12, and at some point he says, nobody believes that Netanyahu will ever honor the agreement with Gantz. And then he stopped and he thought for a second, he digested a thought, and he said, even Benny Gantz doesn't believe it. So he had to think for a second. Maybe Gantz is the only person who thinks the rotation will happen, because nobody else believed it. I think in this case, in this government, the chance that the rotation comes through, of course, it's far from a given. And that's why when I talked about stability, I talked about 2 years, which is basically Bennett completing his part of the rotation. And then either the government, the switch happens smoothly one way or another, and Lapid is now prime minister and everything stays together, or that's the point where the government actually falls apart and we go to a new election, which, 2 years after what we've been through would be a nice achievement. In their press conference on Saturday, Bennett, in front of the cameras, said, this government will fulfill its days, which is basically to say, I will honor the agreement with Yair Lapid. And they talk about one another as friends, as trusted partners. The dynamic between them is as far as you can imagine from the toxic dynamic that existed between Netanyahu and Gantz, where it was very clear from the beginning that Netanyahu doesn't respect Gantz, doesn't view him as a partner, doesn't look at him as an equal, and is looking all the time for a way to not honor the agreement. And we remember eventually what was the mechanism that he found. That mechanism was intentionally not passing a state budget in order to bring about the collapse of his own government and initiate new elections, just so he doesn't have to honor the agreement with Gantz. I think today, by the way, there's a very clear consensus that Netanyahu regrets this decision. He regrets not following through on the agreement with Gantz, not respecting his own word, because if he had done so right now, November 2021, Gantz, I think, would have become prime minister sometime maybe this week or next. And Netanyahu would have been the alternative prime minister. He would have still controlled the government in practice, because in that government, even though it would at some point have Benny Gantz as prime minister, the coalition partners were all, except for Benny Gantz's own party, were all allies of Netanyahu, loyalists of Netanyahu. It was Likud and the religious parties, basically. So I think Netanyahu deeply regrets it, and he did a terrible mistake. He really dug his own grave in that regard. The relationship between Lapid and Bennett looks very different, but at the same time, 2 years is eternity in politics, and in Israeli politics, it's infinity, I guess. And anything can happen. Some people are inside the government have been very skeptical about the idea that the rotation will happen. I think we heard the most obvious example from Ayelet Shaked, the Minister of the Interior, and she's from Naftali Bennett's party, and she said it's not going to happen. She doesn't see it happen. We'll have to wait and see. We can do a webinar in 2 years. We can mark the date right now and talk about the rotation or election.
And by the way, when you talk about Bibi regretting that he didn't sort of preserve this rotation, I'm assuming, Amir, if he had been alternative prime minister, that might have helped him in all of the court cases he's facing, correct? Which we don't talk about that much, but they are there. They're waiting.
They are still happening. I think the level of public interest in them has become very low. I have my own very, very anecdotal way to judge it, because I used to work at Walla News, the website that is now at the heart of the Netanyahu trial, the website that, according to the prosecution, was used by its owners to curry favor with Netanyahu in return for regulation worth a lot of money. And so my name comes up in the trial at least once a week by one of the witnesses. When it started half a year ago, I would get text messages and invited to give interviews. And of course, my mom would send it in the family WhatsApp group. And today, there can be a day when I'm mentioned 10 times in the day, and my phone doesn't, not a single vibration on the phone. Even my mom doesn't follow it anymore. So I guess, people are kind of tuned out.
People are tired.
Yes.
Until something happens, right?
Exactly. But it's absolutely true that it would have helped him to be alternate prime minister in court and not leader of the opposition. It's a different situation. So I want to add one sentence that is important that I forgot. In the current legal situation that was created when this new government was approved, if Bennett does not honor the agreement with Lapid and we go to new election, the likeliest scenario, it's not a promised one, but the likeliest scenario is that Lapid becomes interim prime minister for the duration of that election. So either way, if it's respected or not, Lapid has a pretty good chance right now to become prime minister. The only thing that stops him from becoming prime minister really is if a different government is sworn in before an election, which to me doesn't look very likely.
And remind our audience, Amir, how many mandates Bennett had in the last election versus Lapid, to your point.
Yeah, Bennett's party, Yamina, received 7 seats in the election, and one of those 7 then basically deserted and went to Likud, whereas Lapid received 17. And in general, I have to say that Lapid's conduct throughout this entire saga has been brilliant, because he, first of all, realized that if he insists on being the prime minister because he's the leader of the largest party, we're not going to get anywhere except for another election. And he agreed to be the second in the rotation and to give the first 2 years to Naftali Bennett, a leader of a much smaller party, because for Bennett to cross over from the Netanyahu camp, Bennett was completely part of the Netanyahu camp until this government was formed. It's a big political gamble, and he needs to have an immediate reward for it. And Lapid also managed to basically bring in the left-wing parties to sit under Bennett by constructing a situation where they don't sign coalition agreements with Bennett's party. Labor and Meretz signed their coalition agreements with Lapid as the alternate prime minister, as the leader of Yesh Atid. So all of these moves that he did, I think really showed that he put his ego aside. And like all politicians, he has a very big ego. I don't want to be too soft on him. He has just as big an ego as Bennett and Netanyahu and the others. But in this specific instance, he managed to put it aside in order to have this government come together. And we'll see if it will also pay out for him eventually when he will enter the prime minister's office according to this agreement.
I'm going to turn to audience questions in a second, and I just want to remind members of our audience to please, if you still have time to put a question in the Q&A, so please feel free. Amir, Defense Minister Benny Gantz and Interior Minister Ayelet Shaked are often singled out as potential weak links in the coalition. Could you envision Gantz, Shaked, or someone else breaking up the government in the near future? And is there anything else you see as a major threat to the coalition's near-term survival?
So again, the biggest concern around that was before the budget, and that seems to have passed. Netanyahu has been selling the Likud loyalists some story about Gantz basically defecting from the government and taking his 8 seats with him into a different government with Netanyahu. You know, fool me once, shame on you, but fool me twice, shame on me. I think this is Benny Gantz's approach to the idea right now. He would only do it if he is the appointed prime minister. And even then, I think you realize that you know, the morning after such a government is formed, even if he gets to be the prime minister, Netanyahu will orchestrate all kinds of maneuvers to weaken him and humiliate him and really make it irrelevant. And I don't think Gantz is there. And I also don't think the 8 members of Knesset from his party are there. So I don't see that as a very likely scenario. As for Shaked, it's true that she's seen as someone within this coalition who is more hesitant about the whole thing and would have preferred a government with Netanyahu and has dreams about leading the Israeli right wing one day. And she thinks that sitting in this government right now with Lapid and Meretz will harm her. But her ability to actually bring it down, I think, is limited because she's one minister in the government. Most of the members of Knesset from Bennett's party seem to be much more loyal to Bennett than to her. So it doesn't look like she has pieces of the puzzle that if she decides to break it up, she can take with her then. The main damage I think she can cause to the government is if she uses her role as the Minister of the Interior to get the other partners very, very angry and to bring other partners, whether it's Mansour Abbas, whether it's Meretz, to a place where they say, we cannot be a part of this government anymore. And she does have tools in her disposal to do that. If she enacts all kinds of very extreme, outrageous policies against Arab citizens of Israel, against Palestinians, against human rights groups in Israel. I mean, you can think of all kinds of terrible examples that you can do if you come to harm. Maybe she drives them crazy and they say, we'd rather blow up the whole thing. So far, I don't see any evidence of her actually doing that. I think the biggest concern actually was around the budget, that she would somehow play spoiler in that process and bring Mansour Abbas to oppose the budget. It's still a real possibility. I think it's right now, it's more something that is discussed in the press and in the hallways of the Knesset than any concrete evidence, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So turning to audience questions, we have a question from Robert Sugarman, a board member of Israel Policy Forum, who's asking about E1 Givat Hamatos Atarot. Bob asks, he says, Minister Elkin, Zev Elkin, announced, I guess he's housing minister, right?
Yes.
He announced construction in E1, Givat Hamatos, and Atarot, and you might want to explain what the significance is of those three locations without even informing Bennett, Lapid, or Gantz. So if Elkin pushes forward, what impact will it have on the coalition? What, if anything, can Bennett do to prevent a fracture in the coalition? I would just add to that list also the status of the Eviatar outpost and the future of the recently expired law that prevented Palestinian spouses of Israelis from applying for Israeli citizenship. So I know it's a fully loaded question, but you can handle it, Amir.
So this excellent question comes back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, Susie, that still the biggest threat at the end of the day is that events on the Palestinian arena will create such a fracture in this government that they would not be able to sit together anymore. I mentioned the possibility of a war with Gaza, but the issues that Robert mentioned are just as important, and I thank him for this question. Basically, all of these ideas for construction are in specifically strategic places that could harm either the viability of a Palestinian state in the future or the viability of a Palestinian capital in parts of Jerusalem in the future. And this is why previous Israeli governments have avoided these steps, some of them under international pressure. I don't think that fundamentally is going to change. I think that an announcement by Minister Elkin is still not the same as actually seeing it happen on the ground. I'm not saying it's impossible. I don't want people here to be complacent. I don't want people here to think, oh, Amir Tibon said it's not going to happen, we can all just forget about it. Not at all. I'm just saying it's not there yet. And I think these announcements obviously will be met with objections, whether it's from the Biden administration, whether it's from other important allies of Israel, the UK, Germany. So this is a process, but it's definitely, I think, a concern. Aaron David Miller wrote a very good column in CNN about Biden and Bennett, and he had one paragraph there that I thought was key, that after, and this might seem a bit far from each other, but it really isn't, that after what happened last week in elections in the US, in Virginia and in New Jersey, although the Democratic governor won re-election, but by a much smaller than expected margin, there is a sense now in the Israeli government that Biden is a bit weaker than he was, let's say, 3 months ago when the Senate passed the infrastructure a package before it went to a very long process in the House. So he is weaker. We see his approval rating going down. We see his party struggling. And this always creates a sense among some in the Israeli right wing. And yes, in this government, there is a representation of the Israeli right wing that now we can push the limits more with the United States. Now we can try them a little more. And maybe at some point after they test and push the limits, there will be a response from the administration, from Congress, from other allies in the world who will say, you've pushed it too far. E1 is a red line for us. And maybe they can get away with other stuff. And I think this is what's happening right now. They are trying to understand what they can get away with, both internally within this complicated coalition and with the Biden administration. But at the end of the day, I think if you ask Ze'ev Elkin, in a one-on-one conversation, what's more important for you, to build in E1 or to keep this government stitched together? I'm not sure he will say E1. The flip side of that is if you ask Nitzan Horowitz in a closed room, really, what's more important for you, that there will be no building in E1 or to keep this government together? I'm not sure what his answer is either. So that's why it's complicated. And I do think the international element will be very significant on all of these developments. How strong will be the pushback from allies abroad?
And a quick follow-up before I get to another question. Bennett and Lapid obviously have different views on the two-state solution. I mean, Lapid so far has shown evidence that he's in favor. Bennett talks about shrinking the conflict while not shrinking the territory. And on the one hand, the Bennett government is taking some steps to improve the lives of Palestinians. But at the same time, these other moves clearly could contradict that if it makes an eventual two-state solution impossible. And I'm a little confused by Lapid on this, to be quite honest with you. I don't know where his messaging seems confusing to me.
I think, Susie, that everyone is confused about this, including Bennett and Lapid themselves. I don't think they really know what they're doing on this one. I think they're trying right now to find again the boundaries of how they can everyone can live together on this. Because when the government was sworn in, one of the mantras that we heard from the different party leaders is this government will not take down settlements, but it will also not take all kinds of extreme steps that would shut the door on a two-state solution. This was basically, the idea was to keep the status quo, try to maybe manage it a little better, economic initiatives, building for Palestinians, or and things like that, but nothing that would really rock the boat in any direction. The problem is, again, when you have ministers in the government who are supposed to be committed to this and they begin to push other kinds of initiatives, and this is where you need a responsible adult. The likeliest candidate to be the responsible adult should have been Bennett himself. You're the prime minister. You're the person that has to manage the relationship with the United States, the relationship with the EU, the important countries, Germany, France, the relationship with Britain and other world powers, and also the security, the relationship, of course, with Egypt and Jordan, which is also just as important, the new emerging relationships with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So, Bahrain, Morocco. So I think he should have stepped in at some point and said, okay, we're not going to, obviously this government is not going to take down any settlements. That's not even the agenda, but we're also going to be more cautious. Maybe he's doing it behind the scenes. We have not seen him do it publicly yet. And I think it's because he's still stuck in his mind in this competition with Netanyahu of who is more right-wing for real. And every time that Bennett gets attacked from the right for being in a coalition with Meretz or Labor, the immediate answer from his supporters is, Netanyahu also sat in a government with Tzipi Livni. Or if they say he's not building enough in settlements, the answer is Netanyahu also froze building in settlements under Obama. At some point, I don't think that's really going to work. And I'm wondering if he will find the courage to, at some point, just take a different approach to this and say, I'm the responsible person here now, and I'm going to restrain all kind of crazy ideas, not because Netanyahu also did it, but because I believe it's the right thing. He's not there yet. And I think that the same goes for Lapid. To tell foreign visitors that you support a two-state solution and you want to preserve it is very nice. But the test is not what you tell members of Congress who are visiting you. The test is, what do you tell Zev Elkin and Ayelet Shaked, your colleagues in the government?
Absolutely. We have another question from James Romanovsky. It seems that members of Likud will tire of being in the opposition, recognizing that if Bibi Netanyahu is no longer leading Likud, they might be able to put together a right of center government. So what is the likelihood of Likud being led by someone other than Bibi? And if so, could they then lead a no confidence vote to bring down the current coalition government to have a new government with Likud, New Hope, Yamina, and Israel Beitenu and the Haredi parties?
I highly doubt that this will happen. The members of Knesset of Likud, most of them want to get rid of Netanyahu. But the voters of Likud, and most importantly, the party members, because Likud is a party that actually has a democratic procedure inside it. It has tens of thousands of members, and they vote and they choose the party leader. They are completely with Netanyahu. There's been no change on that. They are still licking the wounds, and they still think that they need to stand behind him. And I think some of them maybe have not internalized really what the budget passage means for their party. And so the members of Knesset, who are people who live the political life and breathe it, they understand very well what's happening. And most of them would have loved to get rid of him and form a different kind of government and go back to being ministers and being able to give jobs to all of their close supporters and that kind of stuff. But I think the rank and file is still with Netanyahu. And I think there are some similarities to, with Republicans and Trump in the United States. That Trump, at the end of his presidency, the party lost the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, and a lot of governorships and whatnot. But still, I think most of the Republicans are completely with Trump. maybe what we saw in Virginia last week, where you had a candidate who was trying to keep some distance from Trump, right? Didn't want to campaign with him, didn't want him to come into Virginia. Maybe that's a sign that there is some change, but I think it's a very, very, honestly, I see it as a very local example and not representative of the larger place where the Republican Party is. I assume if a Likud a candidate will run for the mayor of Tel Aviv, I think the election is in 2 years, they will probably want to say, I'm a Likudnik, but I don't support Netanyahu. But in the national level, Likud is still very much behind their leader of the opposition.
Back to what we were saying before, as far as you see right now, Netanyahu only is taken down by the court system right now, not the political system.
Or if he decides to retire. I mean, there is an issue that needs to be considered with the court cases that you mentioned, Susie. He needs to pay a lot of money to lawyers. He hasn't paid them so far. He hasn't been paying his lawyers ever since this
Sounds
began.
like Donald Trump.
You said it, yeah. But Donald Trump, before going into politics, was in business, and 4 of his companies went through bankruptcy, and he has some real estate that maybe he can sell off. Whereas, if Netanyahu wants to pay these lawyers, maybe it would make more sense for him to retire from the Knesset and go and sit on, I don't know, give lectures for a lot of money and do all kinds of, be like a board member for companies, or I don't know, stuff like that. But right now, I think the only 2 scenarios is either the court cases, which would take a few more years to run, or if he decides to retire. I don't see him losing power from within Likud.
Okay, I'm going to turn to a question from Nancy Kaplan, who asks that it seems the coalition has thrown many bones to its right-wing factions and forced left-wing factions to swallow stuff that really offends them. Shouldn't the coalition be more balanced here, and what gives other factions some wins? And give other factions some wins, sorry.
Okay, I'm a bit conflicted about the framing of this, because I hear from left-wing friends who share this kind of frustration, and then I hear from right-wing friends who also have like a full stomach on the government. I'm not talking about Likud voters. I'm talking about voters of Lapid, not Lapid, of Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett, who are like, Lapid is running the government, and they see they see the permits that we're giving to Mansour Abbas's party for new building in the Bedouin communities in the Negev. They see Nitzan Horowitz and the leadership of Meretz going to meet Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen in the Mukata in Ramallah. They see Bennett taking so far a very, very cautious public approach on the Iran deal, not blasting Biden for it like Netanyahu did, but everything is done behind closed doors and in a more respectful way. I think that there could be we could go into other examples as well. And it's true, at the same time, we're also seeing, building in settlements. For example, unlike E1, where I'm not sure where it's going to go, I think the Elkin's plan to build to basically double the number of houses in the Jordan Valley, which, it's like in the low thousands, but still, I think that one is actually going to happen, for example. All of it is going to be within the existing communities there. So, that's limited in itself, but it's still one example of something that obviously Meretz and Labor, if it was a Meretz Labor-led government, would not have approved. But I think overall, at the end of the day, this is a coalition that was formed out of a great crisis, which was the 2 years for elections, 2 years, 3 COVID lockdowns, Netanyahu trying to use the power of the state to cancel his own indictment. And everybody still has their eyes on that. Everybody in the government at least remembers that this is what we're trying to avoid. And there, sometimes with I think the gritted teeth is the right phrase in English, but that's just the only real option that is on the table right now.
Now that the budget has passed, do you think the government will pass Gideon Sa'ar's proposed pieces of legislation to establish term limits for the prime minister and bar someone indicted for corruption from serving as prime minister? And in addition, what will the government's other legislative priorities be going forward?
I think those two laws have a pretty good chance of passing. I think they are good laws, and they are, by the way, they would not stop Netanyahu from returning to be prime minister if he won an election 2 or 4 years from now. They wouldn't, because they are not personal retroactive laws. They are laws looking into the future. They would limit Netanyahu's ability to do some kind of an Erdoganistic change of government in Israel like he wanted to do before. But they would not stop him from serving one more term as prime minister. But I think they are good laws, and there's a good chance they will pass. I mentioned before on religion and state, I think there's a lot more that could be done, because in this government you have a coalition that stretches from Naftali Bennett's party, which represents the national religious, kind of more like modern Orthodox in America stream, all the way to Meretz. And then, of course, you have Mansour Abbas's party, which is not a Jewish party, but basically it's secular and modern religious forces. And then in the opposition, you have the far right, Bezalel Smotrich's party, and you have the ultra-Orthodox. And they are really becoming closer and more identical to one another with every passing day. And so with this kind of situation, there's a lot that can be done on religion and state, and there's a lot that can be done, and in the budget, there is already some things that address it, to try to change the threat posed to Israel by the current way of life of the of not all, but large segments of the ultra-Orthodox population. And this sounds like a very harsh thing to say, but I think it needs to be viewed actually as opening the door for opportunity for this population, because the ultra-Orthodox today, together with the Israeli Arabs, are the poorest population in Israel, that has the lowest involvement in the economy, and specifically the lowest level of involvement in the most successful and modern parts of the Israeli economy, the high-tech sector, Israeli innovation. We want to get them involved in that. We want to bring them to the 21st century in a sense. And when you look at the gaps between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the two largest cities in the country, this is what we're talking about. Jerusalem, the poorest city in Israel. Tel Aviv, a city that is seen as the future. And we want to try to close some of that gap. And I think this is one thing the government can definitely have serious work to do with, the whole idea of religion and state, and trying to end the current way of the ultra-Orthodox sector, large parts of it basically being completely dependent on state money, and getting them more involved in the economy.
Well, we could go on for another hour, but we're getting to the top of the hour, Amir. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But of course, we love having you on our webinars and podcasts, and we'll have you back often. So thank you so much for your time and for joining us from right on the Gaza border, Nahal Oz, which is a beautiful kibbutz. We've been there, we've visited you there, and looking forward to going back. Once again, I want to thank our supporters who are with us on today's call, because your generosity makes programs like this one possible. Again, for anyone who has not yet done so, please consider making a contribution today at www.israelpolicyforum.org/support. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the briefings page of our website. As a reminder, you can find a link to register for our 5-part virtual learning series with URJ in the chat below. And as always, I encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, sign up to receive the weekly Kaplo column in your email inbox, and visit our website to access recordings of our previous briefings. Please stay tuned for an announcement regarding our next video briefing. Until then, thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you soon. Amir, Erev Tov, Hamon Toda.
Toda, thank you for all the great work, Susie. And Israel is open for tourism again, so I hope many of our viewers choose to come soon for a visit. Goodbye. Absolutely. For now.
Bye, Litrot. Bye.